Hi, this is our second Zoom meeting, overviewing the questions we had about the articles we read. My name's Emma.
My name's Lindsay.
And I'm Bridget.
So the first article we read overviewed listening skills and how to better listen to our students. What did you guys feel like?
One of the key takeaways I read was just like, if they're talking, don't be like playing with your pencil or on your phone, because you want to be actively engaged in what they're having to say, or else they aren't going to want to tell you like what they need to.
Yeah, that's really true. And one of the questions that I had from the article came from like the poor listeners versus the effective listeners. And like one of the things that it says is sometimes that the subject is so dry, so they tune it out, and then an effective listener finds what's in it for me.
He's got 2 minutes.
I just thought that was like what my question was, how do we make sure that we're like effective listeners versus poor listeners? Like, what do you guys do when you're in a meeting to make sure you're effective?
I think one of the things that like I got from the article and that I really try to like implement is not planning what I'm gonna say next, but instead of just like listening to them, because sometimes like their body language and what they say like constantly changes, and so you have to like continuously pick up on like little hints that they're putting out there. And so if I'm like in my mind thinking, okay, this is where I'm gonna take the conversation next, I miss out on those. And so I think that's like one thing that has better improved.
And one thing, it was actually in one of our discussion boards that I read. They were saying like it's okay to have those like pauses in between. Like you don't need to respond super fast, because maybe like they are thinking of something else to say, but it just takes their like mind a little bit to think about it. So it's okay to have those awkward pauses to let them think.
That's true. That's true. What are a question that either of you guys have?
I think one of my questions is like when you do get to those points in conversations where it feels like, you know how sometimes the student's really interested in something and you finally like make that connection, but it's not something that maybe you're passionate about, but you want them to continue on. So like how do you find questions that are geared towards the student that like makes it so the conversation doesn't stop, or you get to that point where it's like kind of like a cactus, like it's all dry and whatnot?
No, that's one of the hardest things, especially like I've always wondered when they don't want to talk to you and you're kind of like pulling at them like, hey, like, will you tell me something? And they just don't want to. So sometimes like that's a little hard. And that's one of my things.
Yeah, I think I've had both of those students where I'm like, I don't know anything about like the anime stuff. I do not know anything, and people are very passionate about it. And so I kind of treat it like almost like when you're talking to like a kid, which sounds really horrible, but how you ask them a question, they're like, oh, tell me about it. And then they go off and they're like, blah, blah, blah. Like a little kid brings you a painting, and instead of being like, oh, like I like this or like that, you say, oh, this is beautiful, like tell me about it. And so I think that's something you could maybe use with your student. Like they tell you something interesting, you're like, wow, I don't know very much about that. Tell me about it. Like, what do you like about it? Maybe that would be helpful. Does that?
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, that was one of mine. And then your question, what was it again?
Mostly if they don't want to talk to you.
Oh, they don't want to talk to you. Do you have any good advice for me?
I think again, like just like going over the basic sheet and then like trying to maybe make that little like, what are you interested in, and then trying to like make that connection, like you said, like, well, tell me about that. And I mean, there's obviously gonna be students who are really not gonna want to talk, and so sometimes it's nice to be like, okay, well, try to find anything, like going over their class schedule, being like, hey, now tell me about this class, tell me about this professor, tell me about these activities, and just because you don't want to like pull teeth and make it like uncomfortable for them as well.
But no, I think that's really great.
One of the questions that I was using was like, what do you like to do with your friends? Because like that's kind of on the sheet, like, what do you like to do? And then kind of go off that. So you like to go play volleyball? Like, why do you like volleyball? Kind of not pulling teeth, but more like an investigation. Like,
Okay.
You
Details
do
about
like
everything.
this. No, tell me about it. That's what I kind of had to do with one of my quiet students. And then I opened up a can of worms when I hit basketball. Like, he was not saying anything. And then I was like, oh, like, you're taking the HPC class. Do you lift? Or, like, what do you like to go do? And he's like, oh, I actually go play basketball. I'm like, you like basketball? Me too. Like, what do you like? And then he was like, blah, 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 blah. So that could be helpful.
Yeah. It's really good.
I like that.
Now,
Another question I kind of had, and I put this in my article, or my journal, but how to do like the mirroring without being annoying, you know?
Yeah.
Like, some people, like when you're
Yeah.
talking, they're like, oh yeah, and they like keep repeating what you're saying, and you're like, I do not like talking to you. Like, you're so annoying.
This just isn't working.
So how do you mirror effectively?
I feel I do it more in like body like image, you know? Like if they're more relaxed, I try to be more relaxed and not up in their space. But if they're a little bit more like, oh, excited about talking, then I'll be a little bit more excited. I feel like it's just kind of matching what they do instead of like repeating, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Does that help?
It does a little bit. What do you think?
I thought I had the same question too, and then like I kind of just figured that you want to do a good balance between that and paraphrasing. Like, yeah, there's sometimes where maybe you mirror like if they're like on their emotional or their body language side, but sometimes too, like when they say something or they tell you a story or they're like, yeah, my class is going all right. Like there's some things like that are going wrong with. You're like, okay, so it's not going as well as you had imagined. What's going wrong? Type of thing. So incorporating the questioning side of it and the active listening, as well as, Kate, now let me match you. And like, this is what I'm getting from where you're at. Tell me more about it. That makes sense.
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do you guys have other questions? Do you have a question?
I have a question about like questioning skills. So like, you know how we're supposed to like open-ended to instead of like close-ended? Do you have like an example of one of those? Any?
You know how you were talking to me the other day, and you were like, and we were just kind of talking about that. It was yesterday, yeah.
Yeah.
And then you said, oh, maybe I could ask you about your wedding. And then instead of saying like, oh, was your wedding good? That'd be like, oh yeah, it was. Like I could just say that and just end it because that answered your question. Instead say like the questions that lead into something. So like, oh, how was your wedding? Or how was this or that? And then it gives me a chance to explain something that you can then again build off of and keep the conversation flowing.
Okay.
What do you think, Emma?
I think I took a class in the summer, and something we went over was like open-ended and closed-ended. And so like those closed-ended questions are like your yes or no, and so it's kind of like a conversation stopper. So like when you start with your open-ended question, you want them to explain, and you're going into detail, and then it gets to a point where like you want to know specifics. You're like, okay, was it this or that? And they can answer with that one word. And so when you want them to be like talkative and you want them to open up, you're like, okay, now tell me more about this, or tell me more in general, something like that.
Okay, that's super helpful.
Do you have a question? I do if you don't, but you can go first.
Well, you got it. I can go.
Okay. How are the best ways to like follow up for you guys? That's something huge for me. Is I have my conversation. I ask them what they're doing or like their goals. How are the best are you following up besides just your meetings?
Are you talking about like if you talk about a certain subject
Yeah.
and then a good way, I've been like writing stuff down. If I'm like, oh, I'm gonna ask them about this, I'll like write it on a piece of paper so that the next time I see them like in class, like before the class starts, I'll be like, oh hey, like how did your English test go? Or just like if we talked about something specific, because then they definitely like are like, oh my gosh, like they remembered and they asked me about it.
That's
So
a good idea. I should bring a paper like ask them about this. So I
Make a
want to
list
know.
for every-
yeah.
And I feel bad if I don't like see them.
I know, it's hard.
Okay, that's good.
I feel like I run into a lot of my students at activities or just on campus too, and like you see them and it can be like that quick, like hi, like how are you? But then when I'm like, oh, okay, like I remember this that we talked about in our meeting, like bring that up. But then I think it too is like at the end of meetings, I'm like, hey, here's my work number, like shoot me a text about this. Like if it goes well, if it doesn't, let me know if you need help on anything. And like those students that you make the connections with, which is like most students during meetings, are more than welcome to like send you a text, be like, hey, like the test went really well, and then like following up on that. And so I feel like sometimes it is hard because you only see them in class like what, once a week, and very rarely on campus, and so
And some need that connection of like
Yes.
a professional friend, older sister, you know?
Yeah.
I really do.
So that's helpful.
Do you have any questions?
I have questions about like the, again, like the questioning. How do you find questions that will like be more engaging to the students, so they're not like that general like, what are things you're interested in? Do you know what I'm talking about? Like, make it more specific to them.
I kind of start at general and then kind of wean off the general.
Mm-hmm.
So like I do have to ask the general questions because like I don't know who they are.
Right.
So for example, yesterday I met with this guy who really likes soccer and he did soccer all of high school. It's like, oh, you really like soccer? Like, have you looked into any clubs on campus? And then he's like, no, blah, blah, blah. And I say, oh, I go to the futsal club Thursdays at 8. You should come. And like, have you ever tried futsal? And it kind of leads into it. Opportunity plus resource and more of a conversation starter. Because like we know most of the resources. We had to fill it out to be a peer coach, you know?
Right.
So just finding something for them to do plus the asking, it makes it more of a trail down a road to help them find their way and have a conversation instead of just basic question and just move on, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that's something we all have in common is we know the resources.
Yeah,
so
so-
use them. What do you think?
Another thing I like to do is like kind of assess when they first walk in, because like some girls, a lot of mine are population health, which is mostly girl related, and so like depending on how they're like dressing, I'll kind of like go off that. A lot of girls wear rings. I'm like, oh my gosh, like where'd you get your rings? Like, have you been to the ring stores down here? Or like if they're in gym clothes, I'm like, oh my gosh, do you like going to the gym? Like, what do you like doing there? So it just like I kind of do that a little bit and just base it off that.
Yeah.
Nice,
I like that.
That's a good one. I asked this girl about her crystal necklace and
Yeah.
she's gonna start a crystal club here.
Oh,
on
really?
campus.
So cool.
Yeah.
Oh,
With
how
like
fun.
the healing crystal,
Oh,
like that kind of
wow.
thing. I was like,
Yeah,
It's
that's
another
pretty
club for us to join.
Yeah,
Yeah.
see? We'll join
you're
it.
welcome.
Add it to our resources.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Do we have any more questions? Do you guys have questions?
I think I'm good.
Yeah, I think we're
Okay.
good.
Awesome. Thank you, professor.
Thank you.